There is a space you have entered that has no name for itself yet. You can feel it. Not in the way you feel an emotion, not in the way you feel a decision forming, but in the way you feel the ground when it shifts just slightly beneath your feet, and you cannot tell if you moved or the earth did. Something inside you is no longer where it was. And the strangest part is not that it moved. The strangest part is that you cannot go back to find it. You have probably tried. You have probably reached for the version of you that existed 6 months ago, a year ago, some specific morning when you woke up, and everything still made sense in the old way. You reached for that person the way you would reach for a light switch in a familiar room. But your hand found only wall. The switch is not where it used to be. And now you are standing in a room you have lived in your entire life, and it is dark in a way it has never been dark before. And you are being asked to do something that no one ever taught you how to do. You are being asked to stand still in a space that has not yet decided what it is. This is not a breakdown. This is not confusion in the way your mind wants to categorize confusion. This is something far more specific and far more rare. And it is the thing that no one prepares you for when they talk about transformation. They tell you about the before. They tell you about the after. They paint the contrast in vivid terms, the old self falling away, the new self rising, the breakthrough, the awakening, the moment of clarity that changes everything. But they leave out the middle. They leave out the part where you are neither. The part where you are suspended between two versions of yourself, and both of them feel equally unreal. The part where you are not lost exactly, because lost implies there is a destination you have simply failed to find. This is different. This is the dissolution of the map itself. And what I want to do with you today is walk directly into that space. Not to fix it, not to rush you through it, but to show you what is actually happening in that gap, at the level of your neurons, at the level of your quantum participation in reality, at the level of the deep architecture of selfhood that most people never examine because it operates so far below conscious awareness that they mistake it for the ground they are standing on. It is not the ground. It has never been the ground. And the moment it starts to dissolve is the moment you discover what was holding you up all along. Let us begin with what your brain is actually doing when identity becomes unstable. Because this is not philosophy. This is measurable. There is a region of the brain, a network really, called the default mode network. You have probably heard the term, but most people do not understand what it actually does in the context of selfhood. The default mode network is not just the part of the brain that activates when you are daydreaming or mind-wandering. It is the part of the brain that constructs the narrative of you. It is the neural architecture that takes the raw, unstructured flow of sensory data and experience and organizes it into a story with a main character. That main character is who you think you are. The default mode network is what allows you to feel like the same person who woke up this morning, the same person who existed yesterday, the same person who has a history and a trajectory and a set of preferences and fears and desires that form a coherent thread. Without it, experience would arrive as a series of disconnected moments with no one at the center to claim them. The default mode network is, in a very literal neurological sense, the author of your identity. Now here is what matters. This network does not construct your identity from truth. It constructs it from repetition. It builds the story of you from the patterns that fire most frequently, the emotional reactions that occur most reliably, the thought loops that cycle most consistently. Your identity, neurologically speaking, is not a discovery. It is a habit. It is the most rehearsed pattern in your entire nervous system, and it feels real for the same reason that any habit feels natural, not because it reflects some deep truth about who you are, but because it has been repeated so many times that the brain treats it as a default. If you are beginning to see how deep this pattern runs, there is something I want to share with you. Have you spent years chasing manifestation, visualizing, affirming, raising your vibration, only to watch the same patterns repeat? Every traditional method assumes the same thing, that you are separate from what you want. That separation was never real. You were chasing a signal you were already broadcasting. Beyond the frequencies, a quantum guide to consciousness mastery walks through all 9 frequencies, from the dense transmissions trapping you, through the ascending currents, to the master frequencies where consciousness becomes the field. Every method you tried sent a signal outward. This one tunes the signal you already are. Every day you delay, your nervous system broadcasts the same old signal, and breaking free gets harder. So move on it tonight. The link is in the pinned comment below. Now let us return to what happens when those rehearsed patterns begin to break down. This is why the phase you are in feels so disorienting. What is happening is that the default mode network is losing coherence. The patterns it relied on to construct the narrative of you are weakening. Not because something broke, because you stopped feeding them. Every time you paused before reacting where you used to react instantly, you withdrew energy from a neural pathway. Every time you noticed a thought pattern instead of being consumed by it, you reduced its firing frequency. Every time you chose differently, even in some small interior way that no one else could see, you disrupted the repetition that was keeping your old identity stable. And now the network is struggling, not failing, struggling. It is like a writer who has been telling the same story for decades, and suddenly the main character stops behaving predictably. The writer does not know how to continue the narrative. The sentences start and stop. The plot becomes incoherent. There are gaps where there used to be smooth continuity. And you follow those gaps. You feel them as the strange, hard-to-name sensation that something is off without being able to point to what exactly changed. This is reorganization at the most fundamental level of neural processing, and it has a name in neuroscience. It is called a phase transition. The term comes from physics originally. A phase transition is what happens when a system moves from one stable state to another. Water becoming ice, ice becoming vapor. The critical feature of a phase transition is that there is a point in the middle where the system is neither one thing nor the other. It is between states. And in that between state, the system's behavior becomes unpredictable, non-linear, and highly sensitive to small influences. Your nervous system is undergoing exactly this. The old stable state, your previous identity, the set of automated responses and interpretations and emotional patterns that defined how you moved through reality, that state is losing its hold. But the new state has not crystallized. You are in the liquid phase. You are in the moment where the water is no longer ice, but has not yet become steam, and everything feels fluid, unstable, and strangely responsive in ways you are not used to. If this is resonating with something deep inside you, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so we can keep exploring these depths together. This is where the quantum dimension of the experience becomes impossible to ignore. And I want to be precise here because Precision matters when you are talking about things that most people either dismiss entirely or accept without understanding. In quantum mechanics, there is a principle that has been experimentally verified so many times and in so many variations that it is no longer debatable. It is simply a feature of reality at the most fundamental level we can measure. The principle is this: the act of observation determines the outcome. Before a quantum system is measured, it exists in what physicists call a superposition, a state where multiple possibilities coexist simultaneously. The particle is not in one place or another. It is, mathematically and experimentally, in all possible places at once. It is only when an observation occurs, when a measurement is made, that the system collapses into a single definite state. This is not a metaphor I am borrowing loosely. This is the actual result of experiments like the double-slit experiment, first performed with electrons and later confirmed with photons, atoms, and even molecules of increasing size. When no detector is watching, particles behave as waves, passing through both slits simultaneously, creating an interference pattern on the detection screen that can only be explained if each particle traveled through both paths at once. But the moment a detector is placed at either slit to determine which path the particle takes, the interference pattern vanishes. The particle behaves as though it chose one path. The act of looking forced a single outcome from a field of possibilities. John Wheeler, one of the most respected physicists of the 20th century, took this even further with his delayed choice experiment, proposed in 1978 and confirmed experimentally decades later. In this version, the decision about whether to observe which path the particle took was made after the particle had already passed through the slits. And yet the result still changed based on the observation, as if the particle retroactively adjusted its behavior to be consistent with whether or not it would be observed. Wheeler himself said that we are not merely observers of the universe. We are participators. The past, he suggested, is not fixed until it is observed. Now hold that in your mind and bring it back to what is happening inside you. Because here is the connection that matters, and it is not a loose analogy. It is a structural parallel. Your identity has been functioning like a fixed measurement. For years, perhaps decades, you have been observing yourself in one consistent way. You have been collapsing the superposition of who you could be into one definite outcome, the same outcome over and over. Every morning you woke up and unconsciously measured yourself against the same criteria. Am I the kind of person who reacts this way? Am I the kind of person who feels this way about that situation? Am I the kind of person who can or cannot do this thing? And every time you performed that measurement, you collapsed the infinite field of possibility into the same particle, the same fixed point, the same identity. You were not discovering who you were. You were selecting who you were from a field that contained far more than you ever allowed yourself to see. And now the measurement has become inconsistent. You are no longer observing yourself in the same way. The detector has shifted. The criteria you use to collapse yourself into a single identity are weakening, changing, dissolving. And because the observation is no longer fixed, the system is returning to something closer to superposition. You are no longer one definite thing. You are, for perhaps the first time in your adult life, genuinely undefined. This is what the in-between actually is. It is not a gap between two identities. It is the superposition state itself. It is what you look like, what you feel like when you are no longer being collapsed into a single outcome by your own habitual self-observation. And this is why it feels so profoundly uncomfortable. Your entire life, your mind has been structured around the assumption that you are one thing, one consistent self, one story, one set of preferences and patterns and reactions that define you reliably across situations. The default mode network built that consistency. Your neural pathways automated it. Your emotional body reinforced it. And now all of that is loosening, and what you are encountering is the raw, unstructured field of possibility that was always underneath the identity you thought was solid. The discomfort you feel is not a sign that something is going wrong. It is the sensation of being uncollapsed. It is what it feels like to exist as potential rather than as a fixed point. And your mind, which has spent its entire existence turning potential into fixed points, does not know what to do with this. So it panics. Quietly, subtly, in ways that do not always look like panic. It overthinks. It analyzes. It searches for the next identity to collapse into so it can feel stable again. I want to pause here and ask you something. When did you first notice the old version of you starting to dissolve? Was there a specific moment? Or was it more like a slow fading that you only recognized after the fact? Share that in the comments, because naming the moment has a way of making the process more real. This is the critical juncture. This is where most people, without realizing it, abort the entire process. They feel the instability of the in-between, and they interpret it as a problem. They interpret the lack of a clear identity as evidence that they are lost, that something went wrong, that they need to figure things out. And so they start figuring. They start analyzing. They start making decisions and drawing conclusions and building frameworks. And every single one of those actions is, at the quantum level, a measurement. Every conclusion is a collapse. Every definition is a reduction of the superposition back into a single state. And here is the devastating part. The only states they know how to collapse into are the ones that already exist in their neural repertoire. The old ones, the familiar ones, the patterns that feel like clarity because they have been rehearsed 10,000 times. So the person who was genuinely in the process of becoming something unprecedented, something their nervous system had never been before, pulls themselves back into a slightly modified version of who they already were. They call it growth. They call it clarity. They call it finding themselves. But what actually happened is that they could not tolerate the superposition long enough for something genuinely new to emerge. I want you to understand how specific this mechanism is. There is a phenomenon in quantum physics called quantum decoherence. It describes what happens when a quantum system that exists in superposition begins to interact with its environment in ways that destroy the superposition. The system does not collapse because someone consciously observes it. It collapses because it becomes entangled with too many external factors, too many environmental interactions, too much noise. The delicate state of holding multiple possibilities dissolves into a single classical outcome, not through any dramatic event, but through accumulated interference. This is exactly what happens when you cannot sit in the in-between. Every time you check in with your old emotional patterns to see if they still fit, that is environmental interference. Every time you ask yourself, "Who am I?" and demand an immediate answer, that is a measurement that forces collapse. Every time you compare your current undefined state to the defined state you used to inhabit and conclude that you have regressed, that is decoherence. You are not failing. you are interacting with the process in a way that prevents it from completing. The physicist David Bohm, who spent decades exploring the relationship between quantum mechanics and consciousness, proposed something he called the implicate order. Bohm suggested that the reality we perceive, the world of separate objects and definite outcomes and fixed identities, is what he called the explicate order. It is the unfolded, visible surface of things. But underneath it, enfolded within it, is a deeper level of reality where everything is interconnected, undivided, and in constant motion. The implicate order is not a place. It is a depth. It is the level of reality where possibilities have not yet been separated into distinct outcomes. What Bohm was describing is, in essence, the space you are in right now. The in-between is not a void. It is the implicate order of your own identity. It is the depth beneath the surface self, the place where the next version of you is not yet unfolded, not yet explicate, not yet separated into the definite traits and reactions and patterns that will eventually become your new way of being. And it cannot unfold properly if you keep reaching into it and trying to pull things out before they are ready. There is a practice that belongs specifically to this understanding, and I want to offer it to you now. Not as a technique to master, but as something to inhabit during this phase. The next time you feel that pull, that urgent internal demand to define what is happening to you, to categorize your state, to decide whether you are progressing or regressing, growing or falling apart, I want you to do something very specific. I want you to locate the physical sensation that accompanies that demand. Not the thoughts, not the narrative, the sensation. Because the demand to define yourself always has a physical signature. For some people, it lives in the chest, a tightening, a compression, as if something is trying to close around an open space. For others, it is in the throat, a constriction, the body's version of trying to speak a name for something that does not have one yet. For others, it is in the stomach, a dropping sensation, the felt sense of groundlessness. Find it. Do not name it. Do not interpret it. Do not decide what it means. Simply feel the physical texture of it, the temperature of it, the shape of it, the weight or weightlessness of it. And then, instead of doing anything about it, breathe into the space around it, not into the sensation itself, into the space that surrounds it, as if you are widening the room that the sensation exists in without trying to change the sensation at all. What you are doing, in neurological terms, is activating a different mode of processing. You are shifting from the default mode network, which wants to narrate and define, to a more present-centered awareness that can hold experience without categorizing it. You are, in quantum terms, refusing to perform the measurement. You are allowing the superposition to continue. You are letting yourself remain undefined for a few more moments, a few more breaths, and in those moments, the system has space to reorganize without being forced back into a familiar pattern. This is not passive. This is one of the most difficult things a human nervous system can do. It is the equivalent of holding your hand over a flame and choosing not to pull it away, except the flame is uncertainty and the pulling away is the mind's compulsive need to know. You are training yourself to tolerate the in-between, to exist in the implicate order of your own becoming without demanding that it unfold on your schedule. Now, I want to take you deeper into something that happens in this phase that almost no one talks about, because it is genuinely strange and it does not fit into any of the usual frameworks for understanding personal change. When your identity is in superposition, when you are no longer consistently collapsing yourself into a single defined self, your relationship with time changes, not metaphorically, perceptually. You may have already noticed this. Days feel like they have a different texture. Some hours stretch in ways they never used to. Others compress. You may find yourself unable to remember what you did yesterday with the same clarity you used to have, not because your memory is failing, but because the self that would have organized those memories into a coherent narrative is no longer operating at full capacity. Without the default mode network running its usual story, time loses its linear scaffolding. Events stop arranging themselves into a neat before and after. They start to feel more simultaneous, more layered, as if the past and the future are both present in the current moment in a way that is hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. This is consistent with something that physics has been suggesting for over a century, but that most people have never truly absorbed. In the block universe model that emerges from Einstein's relativity, time does not flow. Past, present, and future coexist as a single four-dimensional structure. What we experience as the movement of time is a product of our perspective within that structure, not a feature of the structure itself. The physicist Carlo Rovelli has written extensively about how our experience of time's passage is generated by the limitations of our perspective, by the fact that we are embedded within the system we are trying to observe. When those limitations shift, when the identity that was organizing your experience of time loosens its grip, your perception of temporal flow changes with it. This is not a malfunction. This is what it feels like when the observer is in transition. You are experiencing time differently because the self that was filtering time into a particular sequence is no longer fully operational. And in that gap, you get glimpses of something that mystics have described for thousands of years, and that physics has been circling around from the other direction. The sense that all moments are somehow present, that the future is not something you are moving toward, but something that is already here, enfolded in the current moment, waiting for an observer stable enough to unfold it. The Advaita Vedanta tradition, one of the oldest philosophical frameworks for understanding consciousness, has a concept that maps onto this experience with remarkable precision. It is called the witness, the Sakshi. In Advaita, the witness is not a part of you. It is what you are when every part has been removed. It is the awareness that remains when thoughts stop, when emotions quiet, when identity dissolves. It is not a higher self in the way that term is usually used, as if there is a better version of you hiding somewhere above you. It is the ground of consciousness itself, the unchanging awareness in which all changing experiences appear and disappear. What is remarkable about the Advaita framework is that it describes the in-between not as a transitional phase, but as the closest you have ever been to your actual nature. The identity you are losing was never who you were. It was a pattern appearing in awareness. The confusion you feel is not confusion about your identity. It is the dissolution of the illusion that you ever had a fixed one. And the witness, the awareness that is watching all of this happen, the part of you that notices the discomfort without being the discomfort, that observes the thoughts without being the thoughts, that can feel the groundlessness without being destroyed by it. That witness has not changed at all. It has not transitioned. It has not shifted. It is exactly what it has always been. The only thing that changed is that the noise that was covering it got quieter. Tell me in the comments, What is one pattern or belief about yourself that you can feel loosening its grip right now, even if you do not yet know what is replacing it? This is the part that rewrites everything if you let it. Because the question you have been asking, "Who am I becoming?" assumes that identity is something you build. Something you construct from the materials of experience and thought and decision. But what if identity, real identity, is not constructed at all? What if it is revealed? What if the in-between is not a construction zone where a new self is being assembled, but a clearing where what was always there is finally becoming visible because the structures that were blocking it are falling away? This changes the entire orientation of the experience. Instead of anxiously waiting for a new identity to form, you begin to recognize that something is already present that does not need to form. It does not need to be built. It does not need to stabilize. It is already stable. It has always been stable. It is the one thing in your entire experience that has never changed, never wavered, never been in transition. And it is so close to you, so intimate, so fundamental, that you have been overlooking it your entire life in favor of the louder, flashier, more dramatic content of thoughts and emotions and self-concepts. The witness does not care what identity you settle into next. It will observe that identity the same way it observed the last one, with perfect neutrality, with complete presence, without attachment. The in-between feels terrifying to the mind because the mind is losing its project, its story, its main character. But to the witness, the in-between is just another experience appearing in awareness. No more threatening than a cloud passing through a sky that has never been touched by any cloud that has ever passed through it. Now I want to bring this into the most practical territory possible, because understanding this intellectually changes nothing. The shift happens in the body. It happens in the moment. It happens in the specific, granular texture of your daily experience. There is a moment that occurs dozens of times a day during this phase, and it is the moment where the entire transition either deepens or reverses. It is the moment between a stimulus and your response. Viktor Frankl described this space, though he was speaking from the extreme context of surviving a concentration camp. He said that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space is our freedom and our power to choose our response. But what I want you to see is something even more specific than what Frankl described. During the in-between phase, that space gets wider. It gets wider because the automated response system, the one that used to fire instantly based on your old identity, is no longer fully operational. The neural pathway that would have produced an immediate reaction is weakened. It still fires, but slower and with less conviction. And in that widened gap, you encounter something you may have never encountered before. You encounter the raw, unprocessed stimulus without any identity-based interpretation layered on top of it. Someone says something to you that would have triggered defensiveness 6 months ago. The words arrive. You hear them. And then there is a pause. Not a pause you chose. A pause that appeared because the machinery that would have generated the defensive response is no longer running at full speed. And in that pause, you feel something strange. You feel the words as vibration, as sound, as raw data arriving at your nervous system without a story attached. For a fraction of a second, before the mind catches up and starts constructing a narrative, you experience reality without the filter of identity. And that fraction of a second is the most important moment in your entire transformation. Because in that fraction of a second, you are the witness. You are pure awareness encountering raw experience. No self, no story, no identity. Just consciousness meeting what is. And then the mind catches up. It starts interpreting. It starts constructing. It starts trying to figure out who you are in relation to what just happened. And that is fine. That is what minds do. But now you have seen the gap. You have tasted the space before identity reasserts itself. And once you have tasted it, you cannot untaste it. It becomes a reference point that is not built from repetition or habit, but from direct experience. And that reference point is the seed of everything that comes next. Here is what I want you to practice. Not as a formal meditation, not as a technique you schedule, but as a way of being with the moments that are already happening in your life. When you notice the gap, the pause between stimulus and response that has gotten wider during this phase, do not rush to fill it. Do not interpret it. Do not use it as an opportunity to choose a better response. Because even choosing a better response is still an identity-based action. It is still the mind saying, I am the kind of person who responds this way now. Instead, stay in the gap itself for one breath, just one. Feel what it is like to exist without any response at all, without any identity at all, without any story about who you are or what this moment means. One breath of that is worth more than a year of trying to build a new identity from the outside in. Because in that one breath, you are not becoming someone new. You are experiencing what you are before you become anyone at all. There is a phenomenon in quantum mechanics that speaks directly to what happens after you begin to stabilize in this way. It is called quantum tunneling. In classical physics, if a particle does not have enough energy to cross a barrier, it cannot cross. The barrier is absolute. The particle bounces back. But in quantum mechanics, this is not what happens. A particle with insufficient energy to cross a barrier can, and does, appear on the other side. Not by going over the barrier, not by going around it. It passes through it. The probability wave that describes the particle does not stop at the barrier's edge. It extends through the barrier, diminishing but not disappearing. And on the other side, there is a non-zero probability that the particle will be found there. And it is, regularly, measurably. This is not theoretical. Quantum tunneling is the mechanism that powers the sun. Without it, the nuclear fusion that lights our solar system could not occur because the protons in the sun's core do not have enough energy to overcome their electromagnetic repulsion through classical means. They tunnel through the barrier. The sun shines because particles do the impossible. This is the most precise metaphor I can offer for what happens when you stop trying to force your way through the in-between and instead allow yourself to remain in the undefined state long enough for something genuinely new to emerge. The barrier you feel, the sense that you cannot get from here to there, that there is no clear path from who you were to who you are becoming. That barrier is real in the classical sense. If you try to cross it using the tools of your old identity, using analysis and willpower and strategic self-improvement, you will not have enough energy. You will bounce back. You will end up reconstructing a slightly modified version of what you already were. But if you allow yourself to exist in the quantum state, in the superposition, in the undefined space where you are not forcing an outcome, something else becomes possible. The probability wave of your becoming does not stop at the barrier. It extends through it. And on the other side, there is a version of you that could not have been reached by any amount of effort or planning or self-construction. It can only be reached by allowing the wave function to do what wave functions do when they are not being forced to collapse. You do not tunnel through the barrier by trying harder. You tunnel through it by remaining in a state where tunneling is possible. And that state is the in-between. The very space you have been trying to escape is the space that makes the impossible crossing possible. This is why the in-between is not a delay. It is not a waiting room. It is not the pause between the old life and the new one. It is the transformation itself. It is the only state in which genuine discontinuous change can occur. The kind of change that does not follow logically from what came before. The kind of change that cannot be predicted or planned or engineered. The kind of change that, when you look back on it later, will seem like it came from nowhere because it did not come from anywhere in the classical sense. It tunneled. It appeared on the other side of a barrier that should have been impassable. And it did so not because you figured out the right strategy, but because you stopped strategizing long enough for the quantum nature of consciousness to do what it does when it is not being interfered with. Let me tell you what begins to happen when someone actually stays in this space. When they resist the urge to collapse back into definition. When they allow the in-between to be what it is, without rushing toward the other side. The first thing that changes is not internal, it is relational. The people around you begin to respond differently, and they do not know why. Conversations that used to follow predictable patterns start going somewhere unexpected. Conflicts that used to escalate begin to dissolve before they reach their usual peak. People start telling you things they have never told anyone, not because you asked, but because something in your presence has changed. You are no longer broadcasting a fixed signal. You are no longer projecting an identity that other people's nervous systems have to navigate around. You are, for the first time, genuinely open in a way that other people can feel even if they cannot name it. This is not a mystical claim. This is consistent with research on interpersonal neurobiology, the field pioneered by Daniel Siegel that studies how nervous systems interact and influence each other. When your nervous system is locked into a fixed identity pattern, it broadcasts that pattern constantly through micro-expressions, vocal tone, posture, timing of responses, and 100 other signals that operate below conscious awareness. Other people's nervous systems receive those signals and respond accordingly, usually by locking into their own complementary patterns. This is why the same relational dynamics keep repeating in your life. It is not because you are choosing the wrong people. It is because your nervous system is broadcasting the same signal, and other nervous systems are responding to it in predictable ways. When your identity enters the in-between, that broadcast changes. It becomes less fixed, less predictable, less patterned. And the people around you, whether they understand what is happening or not, begin to respond to the absence of the old signal. New dynamics become possible. New kinds of connection become available. Not because you learned a communication technique or worked on your attachment style, but because the identity that was generating the old relational pattern is no longer fully operational. The second thing that changes is your relationship with desire. And this one is subtle enough that you might miss it if you are not paying attention. During the in-between, the things you want start to shift. Not dramatically, not in a way where you suddenly abandon all your goals and move to a mountain. More quietly than that. You notice that certain ambitions that used to feel urgent now feel neutral. Not wrong, not rejected, just no longer charged with the same energy. And other things you never gave much attention to, start to carry a quiet pull that was not there before. You might find yourself drawn to a subject you never cared about. You might feel an inexplicable interest in a skill or a place or a way of being that has no connection to anything in your previous identity. And the mind will try to explain this, try to connect it to the old story, try to make it make sense within the framework of who you used to be. But it does not connect. It comes from somewhere else. It comes from the version of you that is forming in the implicate order, the version that has not yet unfolded into explicate reality, but is already exerting an influence on your felt experience. Pay attention to those quiet pulls. They are not random. They are the early signals of a coherence that has not yet fully manifested. They are the probability wave of your next self, extending through the barrier, showing up as subtle attractions and inexplicable interests before the full tunneling is complete. The third thing that changes, and this is the one that most people find the most disorienting, is your relationship with your own thoughts. During the in-between, thoughts lose their authority. Not all at once, not completely, but gradually, persistently, in a way that cannot be reversed once it begins. You start to notice that a thought arises and you do not automatically believe it. Not because you are practicing mindfulness or applying some technique of cognitive distancing, because the identity that used to give thoughts their authority is no longer fully present. Thoughts used to feel true because they were consistent with who you believed yourself to be. I am the kind of person who worries about this. I am the kind of person who gets angry about that. The thought and the identity reinforced each other in a closed loop. But when the identity loosens, the thoughts lose their anchor. They still arise. The neural pathways still fire. But the thoughts arrive without the weight of identity behind them. And without that weight, they feel more like suggestions than statements, more like clouds than mountains. This is not enlightenment. This is not the end of thought. This is something more specific and more useful. It is the moment when you realize, not as a concept, but as a lived experience, that you are not your thoughts. You have heard that phrase 1,000 times. It has been repeated so often that it has become almost meaningless. But there is a difference between hearing it and experiencing it. And the in-between is where the experience happens, because the in-between is where the identity that was fused with thought begins to separate from it. Not through effort, through dissolution. The glue that held thought and self together is dissolving, and in its absence, you experience thought as something that happens in you rather than something that is you. If someone you know is in this space right now, feeling the ground shift without knowing why, consider sharing this with them. When you extend this understanding to another person, you are not just passing along information. You are creating a resonance between two nervous systems that amplifies the process for both of you, strengthening your own capacity to hold the superposition while giving them permission to stop fighting theirs. I want to close by returning to where we began, to that feeling that something is off, but you cannot explain it. That quiet background shift that you can sense but cannot define. That strange suspension between who you were and who you have not yet become. You now know what that space is. It is not a gap. It is not a failure of progress. It is not evidence that something went wrong with your growth or your practice or your life. It is the superposition state of your own identity. It is the phase transition between one stable configuration of self and another. It is the implicate order of your becoming, the depth where the next version of you is enfolded, waiting not for your effort, but for your willingness to stop interfering with its emergence. The in-between is not something to survive. It is something to inhabit. It is the space where quantum tunneling becomes possible, where barriers that could never be crossed through effort are passed through by a consciousness that has stopped forcing outcomes. It is the space where the witness, the unchanging awareness that you have always been, becomes visible precisely because everything that was obscuring it is falling away. You do not need to know who you are becoming. You do not need a map of the other side. You do not need to feel stable or certain or clear. What you need is to remain in the space where none of those things are available and to discover that you are still here, that something in you is present, aware, and unshaken, even when every external and internal marker of identity has become unreliable. That something is not your next self. It is not a new identity waiting to be born. It is the awareness in which all identities arise and dissolve. And it has been here the entire time, underneath every version of you that you have ever been, unchanged by any of them. The in-between is not taking you somewhere. It is showing you what was always here. Sit with that. Not as a thought, as a felt reality. Let the uncertainty remain. Let the groundlessness stay. Let the mind search for answers and find none, and eventually, slowly, grow quiet in the absence of anything to grasp. In that quiet, something will begin to cohere. Not because you built it, because you stopped blocking it. And when it arrives, it will not feel like becoming someone new. It will feel like recognition. Like remembering something you somehow always knew but could never quite reach because you were too busy being someone to notice what was underneath the being. That recognition is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of a completely different kind of life. One where identity is held lightly, where change is not threatening because you know you are not the thing that changes, where the in-between is no longer a crisis, but a homecoming to the deepest part of yourself. If this reached something in you that does not have words yet, if it named something you have been feeling but could not articulate, stay here. Not with this video, with this space. The one inside you that opened while you were listening. That space is not going anywhere. It does not need you to do anything with it. It only needs you to stop filling it with the old furniture. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper. Leave a comment with what you noticed, not what you think, but what you actually felt shift while you were listening. And share this with someone who is in the in-between right now and does not know that it is the most important place they have ever been. The space between who you were and who you are becoming is not empty. It is the fullest place you have ever stood. You just have to stop trying to leave it long enough to realize what it holds.